Hello, listeners, just dropping by again with another gift, and guess what it is? That's right, another bonus short for between seasons 2 and 3. We're still hard at work on season 3, so I hope you enjoy this story told within the world of Hidden Oaks while you wait for us. I now present to you 10 O'Clock Takers by Robert Dawn. Father Jack Bly was neither used to waking up early nor setting alarms for himself any longer. Now an octogenarian and having lived in a retirement home for elderly or disabled priests for over 20 years, it wasn't as though he had any significant reason to rise and greet the day. More than that, sleep was an escape for him. One of many he sought from the painful waking hours of each and every day. There simply were never enough distractions to occupy his mind and keep his thoughts in the present away from the terrible memories of his past. Especially not here, in this dull place. The aide knocked on his door for the third time this morning. It was very early, especially for this nonsense. The youth had poked his head in previously and said something about needing to get on the road. It was a 2-hour drive to Dublin and they had to get going soon if Jack wanted to catch his flight to the States. The aide set something down on the bedside table with a gentle clunk and again insisted the old priest get up this time. They still had to pack his bags. "I'll pack me own bags. Leave me be. I'll get up," grumbled the priest, as he dismissed the aide with an abrupt thrash of his arm that made the young man flinch and hustle toward the door. "I'll be back in 15 minutes. Have your tea and get ready, Father. We need to go," said the aide, before leaving and closing the door behind him. Muttering, the side-lying Jack opened his eyes. A sleeping auburn cat floated vertically in front of his face. It was printed on the crimson mug the aide had left on his nightstand. From this angle, it appeared that the cat was dead and had been hung by its tail from some unseen rafter to dangle there taunting him, or perhaps threatening him. Jack groaned as he heaved himself up into a sitting position using the hospital-style railing on the edge of his bed. For a minute he just sat there, staring through the wall with his wet, yellowing eyes. He wasn't seeing the peeling, floral-printed wallpaper on the wall in front of him. He wasn't noticing the nauseating mix of smells, bleach, urine, and too many Glade plug-ins. He wasn't hearing the distant, insistent buzz of a nurse call bell. Really, he was peering deep into the recesses of his own mind. The thoughts had already begun to race. Lord, he hated being awake. He hated these incessant recollections. Scratching his paunch through his once white undershirt, he turned his attention to the mug of tea. He opened the second drawer of his nightstand, pushed aside a stack of stained underwear, and pulled out a small bottle of golden brown liquid. He poured it with a shaking hand into the cup until the contents threatened to flood the boundaries of its rim. As he slowly and tremulously raised it to his mouth for a sip, the steam curled up and around the red bloom of his bulbous nose and the sagging purple sacs of flesh below each eye. The tea was hot and bitter, and the whiskey he had poured into it blazed a stinging trail down his throat as he swallowed. It was just how he liked it. He cradled the beverage in both hands between his bare, bony knees. They had already steadied noticeably after only his first small taste. He resumed his blank gaze at the wall as he sat there. The dizzying roulette of his racing ruminations slowed until it settled on a vivid memory from 50 years ago. The same one that visited him every day. The same one he had tried in vain to drown away for half a century now. As the vibrant echo of his past began to play out again, he raised the glass back to his lips and drained the rest of its contents in one gulp. A stream of liquid traced down his face from the corner of his mouth across the stubbled bulldog jowls of his cheeks. Silent tears began to fall from his eyes as he relived the scenes from bygone days, as if he were there all over again. Father Jack was in his 30s then, still young but not necessarily new to his profession. He had already been a man of the cloth for some years by this time. His first calling had brought him to the town of Clifton in County Galway, and it was here in the Clifton parochial house where Father Jack received a unique training from an elderly priest. The specialized rites and practices of exorcism were handed down to him while he studied under Father Cillian in the parochial house. He spent a few years becoming proficient in his new duties before being moved to fill a vacancy in the Leitrim parish. He had practiced here ever since and had grown to love the rural towns around him and considered them his new home. It was a cool and dreary spring. There had been more clouds and rain that year than even an Irish countryside could grow used to. He had been sent to assess the nature of events that had been occurring in a home outside of the Leitrim village proper. A family had asked the church for assistance in dealing with incidents that had grown distressing. Not knowing where else to turn, they had requested an exorcism of the house, or at the very least a blessing from the priest. Every parish was required to have at least one priest trained in exorcism and other similar rites. And in Leitrim, the only man that filled this need was Father Jack Bligh, so he took up the call. A lone father and son lived in a small 2-story farmhouse down a dirt track that snaked its way through the roiling moors of the rural landscape. He puttered and bounced his way down the road in the parish's Ford Anglia. The roughness of the ride threatened to rattle the car to pieces, and Jack was relieved when he pulled through the open gate of the stone wall and into the green, grassy yard of the residence. He gathered his bag and its spilled items and took in the view of the place. There was a forest that wrapped itself to the east of the home before spilling off down the hillsides behind it. As seen from the road in the early spring, it looked to Jack like the copse of trees was a skeletal hand reaching up from the ravines to snatch the house and pull it down into them. But in front and beyond, grassy plains rolled as far as the eye could see. No other residence was in view, though the priest had passed another small house about a mile back toward town. He thought it must be a quiet and lonely life out here for these people. An isolated hermitage such as this was the perfect place for even a sober-minded individual to turn a creaking floorboard into a demonic possession. Jack was greeted at the door by a man whose face and hands had the color and texture of well-worn leather. The look of one who has spent a great deal of time toiling in the dirt beneath the sun, wind, and rain. His eyes were the same dull gray of the sky and almost seemed to have a matte finish to them, like they were dry. His clothes had been patched over previous patches and were so threadbare in spots that it appeared they could disintegrate in the slightest of winds. From what he had heard of this family, he believed the man was about his own age. There was no real greeting from him, just a stare, a nod, and an, "Oh good, you're here. Now we can be done with this nonsense." Upon entering the house, Jack was met with a strong, earthy smell, like dirt and root vegetables, as well as a whiff of wood smoke and tobacco. The place was relatively clean. The rustic man led Father Bligh into the compact kitchen. Here a small table with a red and cream gingham runner and 3 chairs were crammed into a nook beside the counter. The smoky smell was stronger here, and the priest noted the presence of a black iron wood stove, as well as the tobacco pipe and ashtray on the table. A knot of wood popped loudly in the fire as they entered the room, as if it was startled by their presence. The man swept a book that was lying out into his hand and swiftly placed it in a cupboard. He was not fast enough to conceal its title from Jack. It had been 1984 by George Orwell. The Department of Justice had banned the book earlier this year after it had been placed on the list of evil literature by the committee of the same name. The priest said nothing and sat down with the man at the table. Before introducing himself, the man looked over his shoulder and shouted, "Samuel!" Jack heard steps quickly descending the stairs before a timid little black-haired boy in filthy clothes, who couldn't have been more than 6, peered around the corner of the doorway. He was holding onto a hand-sewn stuffed rabbit that was nearly as tattered as his clothing. It was dirty and had an almost eerie paleness to him. His bright blue eyes flashed out from their deep hollow sockets at the priest before being cast down toward his feet. "Samuel, fetch some water and put the kettle on for the priest," demanded the man. "Oh, that's not necessary," started Jack, but the man interrupted him. "Samuel, do it now," he intoned, and the child ran off without saying a word. "Father, the boy has to learn responsibility, and a guest in the house is a fine time." "I'm sorry, I didn't even take the time to introduce myself. My name is Father Jack Bly, from Leitrim Parish, and you are?" "Kier," said the man, still looking at the spot the boy had formerly occupied. He turned to the priest but did not continue. There was an uncomfortable lull in the conversation. "And that was your son Samuel?" asked Jack. "Yes." "How long has it been just the two of you out here?" "Maggie died 2 years ago. Accident in the fields." "I see, I'm so sorry," returned Father Bly. Kier didn't respond, so Jack continued. "So, what is it that you're seeking assistance with, Kier?" After a deep sigh, the man began to tell him how for the past year and a half Samuel had been afraid of things. The priest had to push for more information. It had started not long after the boy's mother died. First, there had been shadows outside that would frighten him at night. Then, they started coming even during the day, to the point where Samuel would not leave his father's side even when he went into the fields to work. "The 10 o'clock takers," Kier said Samuel had begun calling them. "Why the takers?" asked Father Bly. "Well, that's just it. After a while, stuff started to disappear too. The 10 o'clock part was because they would come at night after his bedtime. But even when he started saying they were around in the day, the name just stuck. I don't think they really exist, Father, don't get me wrong." "I see," said Jack. Samuel returned with a small steel bucket of water that he proceeded to pour into a copper tea kettle. He gave a short cry as a sizzling sound erupted from the wood stove. He had spilled some water there and on the floor, leaving a small series of gray concentric rings in the ash around the stove. He gave an uneasy glance at his father, who had stopped talking to stare at the boy. Then he rapidly got to work mopping up the spilled water with a rag. Kier continued his story. He explained how Samuel's toys, small knickknacks, and other things from around the house would disappear, only to turn up near the well or at the edge of the woods in the backyard days later. He grew frustrated with Samuel, thinking it was only the boy acting out in a way because he missed his mother. He plainly told Father Bly how he had beaten the child heavily after some of his tools went missing. After the beatings, the disappearances seemed to stop for a time, but they had come back with a vengeance over the past several weeks. Samuel would burst into Kier's bedroom in the night screaming about the takers. Kier didn't think his son was sleeping much, if at all, lately. Sometimes when he would check on him before going to bed himself, he would find Samuel sitting bolt upright in bed with his blankets wrapped tightly around him, staring toward his bedroom window. No amount of scolding or spankings would stop these behaviors anymore. "I'm beside myself, Father," finished Kier. "Because of this rubbish, I'm not getting any sleep. I'm afraid I'm going to have to put the boy in a home if this keeps up, and I don't know what else to do. In a couple years, he's going to be my help out here, and I don't want to lose that, you see." A low whistle began to emit from the kettle. Samuel promptly removed it from the stove. He poured 2 glasses of tea and brought them to the men at the table. He was about to leave, but Father Jack gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Turning the boy to face him, he leaned down so they were eye to eye. "Samuel, please come sit with us." The child looked out of the corners of his eyes at his father, who raised his eyebrows and cleared his throat. Shoulders slumped, Samuel walked over and sat down next to Jack and stared at his twiddling thumbs in his lap. "Do you think, if I bless the house and the yard, that we can ward away the takers, Samuel?" asked the priest. The child looked into Jack's eyes and shrugged his little shoulders. Kier pounded a fist on the table and growled, "Answer him, Samuel! Mind your manners!" Father Jack fixed his eyes on Kier's and placed a hand over the man's fist, then looked back at the boy. "It's okay, Samuel. Don't you think the Lord would protect you and your father from these things?" The boy nodded, and in a small voice nearly whispered, "Maybe." "I believe it will, Samuel," smiled the priest. "I want to do that for the two of you, and I will stop by from time to time to see how things are going, and if we need to do it again, okay?" Samuel nodded again, this time with more vigor. Father Bligh did his work. He blessed the creaky, steep staircase that led to Keir and Samuel's bedrooms, as well as the stuffy hall between them, where all the heat from the fireplace seemed to congregate. They recited prayers on the moss-covered, rotting boards of the front porch, raising their voices into the icy wind. They went all through the little house and about the property, splashing holy water, brandishing his crucifix and Bible, and reciting prayers, invoking intervention of God, Jesus, and the Archangel Michael in banishing the takers. He brought Samuel with him as he did all of this, even invited him to help by holding icons and reciting prayer passages along with him. In reality, Jack didn't believe in the takers any more than Keir did. He was an extremely devout man. His faith in the Catholic Church and its teachings were strong. But he didn't believe in much of the evil spirits or demonic possessions or any of these things that struck fear into the hearts of many lay people. He thought there were often dark roots that led to these incidents, but more often the darkness was symptoms of trauma, abuse, neglect, or other unmet needs or physical illness. Nonetheless, he knew that his actions could make things better for people. Certainly in this case, if he could ease the mind of the boy, the wrath of his selfish and brutal father could be spared. The man and his son thanked the priest for his services, and Jack in turn offered his gratitude for allowing him to help. Father Bligh crouched down to be eye to eye with Samuel. He reassured the boy that the Lord would watch over and protect him, that he would be able to sleep better now and worry less. He promised to return to check on things once or twice a month and perform the rites again if they needed refreshing. Jack rose and walked to his car. Before he opened the door, he heard a sharp cry. He turned and watched as the child ran across the yard, fell into him, and enveloped him in a tight, almost desperate hug. Jack hugged him back. When he rose, he cast a final glance into the upturned eyes of the boy. The flash of their lapis lazuli brilliance was forever burned into Jack's memory. The car struck a pothole, and Father Jack was jolted back to the present. He sniffed, absently wiped at a tear from his eye, and pulled a flask from his jacket pocket. He took a swig of whiskey and spilled on his shirt as the car struck a bump again. "Are you aiming for the potholes, boy?" snarled the priest. "Are you drinking alcohol in the front seat as I drive? Drunken charge is a £5,000 fine, Father. Now stop that," the aide scolded back. Jack grumbled at him in return, then bringing the flask back to his lips, he turned it upside down and chugged the rest of its contents in one go. "There, now it's done with," he said, returning the flask to his jacket pocket. The aide sighed and ran a hand down his face. Jack looked out the passenger window as they drove silently for a while. Then the aide said, "So are you excited to be heading to the U.S.? Doing a little bit of the old work again, eh, Father?" "I hate planes," muttered Jack. "Well, even so, I'm sure this priest in Minnesota is going to appreciate your wisdom and assistance very much." Was Jack's only response. Giving up on any further attempts at conversation, the aide turned on the radio and drove. Jack watched the grassy hills and plowed fields sweep past them beyond the lanes of the highway. He remembered when this had still been a dirt road. Surprisingly, the countryside around it hadn't changed all that much. The car began to pass them slowly on Jack's side, and as it did, the little boy in the back seat was watching out his window too. He and the elderly priest locked eyes. All he could see of the child in the frame of the window was his mop of black hair and his radiant blue eyes staring back at him. And then the car passed them, and there was nothing but the Kelly green and gold meadows dancing by beyond. Their hypnotic rise and fall lulled him back into the past. Jack had done just as he had promised Samuel. He visited the child and his father once or twice a month after their first meeting. Things seemed to have gotten better after that. The child took a liking to Father Jack. According to Keir, the boy was sleeping better, or at least sleeping at all. Samuel looked less gaunt. His cheeks and face had become more pink than white over these last few months. Even Keir seemed to be almost chipper at times, which Jack wouldn't have even believed was possible. The disappearances had stopped, and there was no further talk of any beatings. This last part relieved him the most. But after only a few months, things took a turn for the worse. When Jack dropped by in the early fall, he found Samuel bruised and afraid, and Keir in all but a rage. The man said he hadn't slept in days. He swore the child had stolen the yoke and reins so he wasn't able to attach his workhorse to the plow, and that he'd been sneaking down in the night to cause trouble with the wood stove and the venting, making it excruciatingly hot and humid upstairs. So much so that Keir would wake up in sweats, feeling like he was choking on the dank, roasting air. The man said he had tried beating it out of the boy, but as before, it hadn't worked. In fact, the behaviors were getting worse. "It's as bad as around the time Maggie passed," said Keir. "What do you mean? I thought you said these things started after she had died," questioned Jack. "Well, yes, some of it did, but it wasn't until lately that the boy started playing games with the heat again. That I remember. About a week before we found his mother, he was playing with the stove and vents to make things get so hot upstairs. You'd wake up feeling like you were in hell itself, coughing and choking." "What exactly happened to Maggie, if you don't mind my asking?" asked the priest. "Maggie? Oh, God. It was truly horrible, Father. I woke up that morning to the heat again. Maggie was already up. Sometimes she would do that, you see. Get up before me, especially if sleeping was uncomfortable. She'd already be out working in the barn or tending the fields, sometimes even in the dark. It was a ripe situation for an accident." He paused for a moment. Father Jack could hear the tremble in his voice and the choked words. He could see by the glistening in the man's eyes that the tears were ready to flow, but he worked hard to push these emotions back and continued his story. "I was alone when I found her. It wasn't long after dawn. Samuel and I had eaten breakfast, and then I went out to look to see what she'd already started for the day. I can only say I'm dreadfully glad he wasn't there with me to see her. The only thing I can figure is that she'd slipped and fallen down and gotten caught up in the plow somehow. And when she was down, the horse had just kept on going. It was way down behind the barn, nearly a quarter of a mile from where she lay, but it had been hitched into the yoke still. You see, she was lying in the plow track, and most of her skin had been peeled right off. It was horrible. Just like someone was taking off a glove. Her face was like that too, flayed right off up to her hairline. No lips, just a big, gaping, toothy mouth surrounded by the meat of her face. Her eyes, just as wide as ever, staring up at me. No eyelids for me to close. I've never wept so hard in my life. I got a shovel and buried her right where she lay. Couldn't bear the thought of anyone seeing her like that, especially Samuel. Oh, my word. I'm terribly sorry. I can't imagine what that must have been like, returned the priest as he touched Keir on the shoulder. I guess I started blaming the boy for her death. That maybe she wouldn't have been so tired, or maybe she wouldn't have gotten up so early that day if he hadn't been playing around with things. That's why I'm so hard on him for it, said Keir flatly. Maybe this is just a slight step back before moving forward. We can try to do the rights again. It helped him for a while. If not, please don't be so hard on him. Sometimes children act out because they don't know the words to explain how they feel. If you need a break, he can always come stay with the baptized Jewish children who live in the orphanage next door to the parochial house. And with that, the two of them agreed. Father Jack spoke again with the boy and reassured him that he would help keep the takers away. Together they performed the rites throughout and around the little house. Jack took time to bless the child's toy rabbit that he learned had been sewn by his mother and that he had carried with him everywhere. They even went out to the edges of the fields, the barn, and to the edge of the nearby woods. He drove back to Leitrim village that day, split between being hopeful and afraid for the boy. The priest intended to check up on them the following week, but he never got the chance. 3 days later, the police arrived at the Leitrim parochial house asking to see Father Jack. Samuel had shown up at the station the night before and told them his father had been killed. He must have walked the 7 miles from the farm into town. He was soaked and muddy from the rain. They had taken him in and cleaned him up. He asked to see Father Jack. They said they had driven out to the family's farm early that morning. There was neither a sign of cure nor any indication of a struggle. The priest asked if he could see the boy. He had already been given to the care of the nuns at the orphanage. The police escorted the priest there, where he found Samuel sitting alone with Sister Mary in the front office. He asked to speak with the child alone. He had been given clean clothes that were 2 sizes too large for him. His blue eyes shone out from his pale round face and seemed to carry all the sadness of the world within them. The bruises that had been visible days before had begun to yellow, but there were newer ones on his face and arms as well. As soon as Father Jack entered the room, the boy clung to his side. "I'm so glad you're here where it's safe, Samuel," said the priest, holding the child tightly. "What happened to you and your father?" The boy immediately began to sob, and in the most words the priest had heard the child speak, he explained as best he could. "The 10 o'clock takers came back. The things we did didn't work. They made it real hot, like when Mama went away. I got out of bed because it was too hot, and when I looked in on Papa, one was there. It was like a black blanket, black like the night. I saw it go over him like he was inside it. It looked like when he would yell at me, but he didn't make any words. Then his skin came off, and he was still like he was yelling. And he was just a skeleton, but his eyes were still there. That's when I ran away. I ran and ran down the road to come and find you. I knew I would be okay with you here." The priest sat silently holding the child as he cried. The boy's breath hitched, and he buried his face in Jack's chest. 10 minutes passed before either of them were able to speak again. "God was watching over you. He gave you the strength to run this time. Your papa won't be able to hurt you anymore, Samuel. Do you think he ran too? Did he follow you?" said the priest. "No, I told you the takers got him," whimpered the boy. "I'll go to your house to see if I can find anything, and I'll talk to your father if I see him. We'll tell him you can stay here for a while to keep you safe. Does that sound okay?" The child nodded, but based on his frown and his distant gaze, Father Jack didn't think the boy believed he would find Keir. They spent the next hour together. The nuns made the child some food, and by the end he was looking slightly less shaken. Sister Mary came to take Samuel to be with the other children. They hugged again, and Jack said he would be back in the evening after visiting the farm. Holding the priest's hand, the child asked one question. "Father Bligh, if you find my bunny, can you bring him back? He helps me to sleep and feel better. He makes me think of Mama, and you blessed him." "Of course I will, Samuel." Boarding had begun on Jack's flight to Minneapolis. His heavy, clinking baggage had been checked by the aide who now stood watching him to the side of the boarding line. His passes checked, Father Bligh began to enter the jetway. "Safe travels, Father. God bless," called the aide from behind him. Jack half-heartedly waved a hand once at his side and continued forward without looking back. He was seated in first class and had the row to himself. He stared ahead, trying to keep his thoughts in the present as hard as he could. takeoff was smooth and uneventful, and as the plane leveled out, flight attendants began descending the aisles with beverage carts. When the young man reached Jack, he asked if he would like a beverage. Double scotch, rocks, said the priest absently. The attendant asked no questions, simply began to prepare the drink. Jack took a break from looking vacantly ahead to watch as the scotch drowned the large cubes of ice in the clear plastic glass. As the liquid filled the container, his terrifying memories took over again. Jack had driven out to Kier's house as soon as he left the boy. He thought that by now Kier would have returned to the home. He had already evaded the police visit. He could see for miles out here, so he would have plenty of time to prepare and watch if he saw that anyone was coming. But Jack thought, or hoped, that the man might not run from him. They had connected, and he had never said anything threatening to the farmer. At this point, he wanted Kier to know that the child was going to safely remain with the nuns in Leitrim, where he would no longer bother Kier, and where he could be cared for. It was a cool day in early fall. The surrounding landscape was quiet. There was no bird song, no breeze, none of the typical barnyard animal sounds greeted Jack's ears as he walked up to the house. Every instant seemed to drag out, and as it did, his senses seemed heightened to an amplification he had never noticed before. As he ascended the front porch steps, he felt as though he had walked into a cloud of warm, moist air, and he shivered as it passed and the briskness of the day settled back onto his shoulders. Several rounds of knocking on the door produced no answer, and instead of waiting any longer, Jack opened it and proceeded inside. As he did so, another drawn-out moment struck him. He perceived that he was being pulled in across the threshold, as though the house itself had drawn in a deep breath. The building centered around the staircase leading to the second floor. It stood in front of Jack after he entered the house and closed the front door. He called out for Kier, but received no answer. After calling again, with a similar result, he began walking the rooms of the main floor around the central stairs. Nothing was amiss. Everything appeared to be in its place. The fire in the wood stove had burned out, and the coolness from outside had begun to seep into the home. He walked through the chilled house that was now familiar to him, bowed ceilings, lightly furnished rooms, and cramped kitchen. Abruptly, the hot, misty feeling pounced on him again and seemed to simultaneously push and pull him on his path. It was stronger this time. It was like walking into a jet of steam and seemed to both press into his chest and pull at his breath when he entered it. He noticed a hint of a sulphurous odor to it as well. It reminded him of the hot springs he had once visited in Iceland. He ducked his head and pressed through it quickly, trying to return to the cool air of the foyer. There had been no sign of Kier so far. Neither had there been signs of a struggle. Just as the constable had told him, everything seemed to be in its place. He studied the creaky stairs, the same ones that he and Samuel had blessed together. Each riser with a worn crescent from countless scores of human steps over the years seemed to be grinning out at him, mocking his inability to find what he was looking for. If the man was still here, he was hiding up those stairs. Or in the barn, Jack thought. Most likely he had run off for a while until the trouble had passed. In that event, Jack wouldn't get a chance to talk with him today. In either case, even if he was gone, the boy's bunny was probably in his room, and he had promised to bring it back to him. As he mounted the first step, the silence was broken sharply by a low, steady creaking noise directly behind him. Jack froze. The creaking ended with a thud, and the priest felt the world rush up behind him. And in that instant, every hair on the back of his neck stood up and an icy fear shot down his spine. Raising his arms and shouting out, he whirled around to defend himself from nothing. The door was open. His car and the fields beyond calmly stared back at him. Not a single blade of grass was disturbed by a breeze. Jack closed the door and pushed it until it latched, and this time pulled back to make sure it wouldn't blow open again. Now assured that it would remain closed, He went upstairs. He felt like he was diving upward into a sauna. The feeling was even more oppressive than it had been below, and again, he noticed that sulfur smell. There were only 2 rooms upstairs with a hall between them, Kier's and Samuel's. He visited Kier's Spartan bedroom first. As he did, the door swung lazily shut behind him. The dirt and sweat-stained sheets of the twin bed were made, and a whitewashed wooden dresser stood across from its foot. There was no other furniture here. Sunlight shone through the grime of a small rectangular window, and before being lost behind another cloud, sprites of dust lazily swam before Jack's eyes. Out the cobweb-coated glass, he could see the Anglia parked in the yard. The heat was even worse in this room. Directly above the kitchen and the wood stove, this made sense. Looking out the window and trying to adjust his collar, which suddenly felt too tight, he tripped on something. And looking down, he saw that it was a pair of boots. They were leather work boots, the kind that laced up halfway to the knee. The heat was growing distracting. Sweat started to race down his forehead, and he was struggling with his collar again. He felt his pulse pound in his temples and the sides of his neck. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears. He looked down at the boots again. They were not only fully laced, but they were tied tightly at the top, the way they would be if someone was still wearing them, not if they had been taken off. He ripped his collar open, tearing it at the side of his throat to do so. He suddenly realized his body was quickly becoming frantic to breathe. It was easily 20 degrees hotter up here, maybe more. His chest was hitching as he tried to catch his breath in this crushing heat. As he began to gasp for breath, he staggered. His vision went dark at the edges like he was going to pass out. He started to stumble around, his arms waving out to catch a wall or furniture on which to steady himself. He seized the doorknob and tore open the door, lurching back into the hallway. It was even hotter here now. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to rupture with every beat. He barreled into Samuel's room at a half run and threw open the door. It crashed into the dresser, toppling everything that was sitting atop it. A few pictures and a small jar of coins clattered to the floor, the change rolling in every direction as though it too were trying to run from the heat. The boy's rabbit was sitting on top of his bed. Father Jack clutched for it, but with his doubling vision missed it twice before laying his hands on it. Taking the stuffed bunny, he ran for the stairs. His hand found the railing, but he slipped at the top and slid down them, striking his tailbone and lower back on the hard wooden edge of each one of the 9 steps. And lying at the bottom, leaning up on the lowest risers, his senses began to return to him. His breathing and heart rate slowed. The heat dissipated. His vision cleared. As the panic left his mind, clarity of thought returned. He stood and looked down at himself. His shirt and coat were so soaked with sweat that they were dripping from the cuffs onto the floor. Drops were falling from his face as well. That's when something occurred to him. Looking in front of him, he saw that he was right. He was again looking at his car and the fields beyond through the wide-open front door. However, that wasn't the only thing. There still appeared to be no breeze outside. There certainly wasn't one reaching inside the house. He would have felt it where he was standing. On top of that, the stifling dank heat would have been broken up by it. But it wasn't the lack of breeze itself that caught his attention. It was the mismatched curtains around the picture window in the living room. He hadn't noticed it before. He remembered the white and red gingham of the one on the right, but the one on the left was entirely new to his memory. Its base fabric was an inky black, but as it rippled in the wind, brilliant iridescent violet and turquoise hues danced across it. It also had a faint, dull red sparkle to it. It looked like the night sky if stars had a crimson hue instead of a bluish white. This one curtain so different from the others in the house, was so out of place that he couldn't believe he had missed it before. Slowly stepping forward, he leaned toward it and squinted his eyes as he studied it more closely. It wasn't just the iridescence he noticed. There was a slight ripple moving through the fabric at its base. His eyebrows knit in a puzzled expression as the cloth suddenly moved more obviously. As he began to cast his gaze upward, his heart went hollow. Everything in his being seemed to leave his body as he was frozen to the spot, watching the most hideous abomination he could never imagine unfold before him. The top of what he thought was drapery took on the form of a head and shoulders as it turned to look at him. A face of a color too dark and hideous to be described was sunken beneath the tattered black shroud of the thing. The whole monstrosity silently glided in a circle and for only a moment leered at the priest with the tiny scarlet dots that were its eyes. They appeared to be lit from behind with some kind of demonic light that pulsed as they contemplated him. Everything in his head was shrieking at him with all its might for him to run away, get as far away from this thing as he possibly could, but he was absolutely restrained to the spot with the deepest horror. He had no choice but to watch as it opened its craggy maw. It looked like the inside of a steel smelting furnace, white hot and yellow at the edges. Then, the only sound he could still remember from that afternoon came to his ears. It was a deafening mix of radio static and screeching violins. He felt his soul blown back thousands of feet behind him. Eyes wide open, mouth agape, Father Bligh felt like his heart had completely abandoned his physical self and had been replaced by the vacuum of space. Pain of a type he could never describe erupted through every nerve ending. The humid, sulfurous heat washed over him as the thing screeched. And then, staring at him the entire time, the Taker, for that's what he believed this thing to be, glided out the open front door and left his sight. For 10 minutes, Jack stared unblinking through the doorway, shaking, telling himself to take every breath, burning tears streaming down his face. He stood there. His pants were wet and heavy. And when he was able, on legs made of gelatin, he staggered to the car. He saw no trace of the thing as he looked around, and with violently trembling hands he pulled open his bag, found a flask of whiskey, and downed its contents in a single swig. The cup of scotch was no sooner placed on his tray table than Jack snatched it up with a violently shaking hand and poured it directly down his throat. He crushed the plastic with a clenched fist, causing the ice cubes to tumble to the floor of the aisle. Tears streamed down his face, staining his shirt, and the plane flew on toward Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport. An aide would be waiting there to pick him up and shuffle him off to a small Catholic church across the street from a little suburban park. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Don, and Owen Swerkstrom. 10 O'Clock Takers was written by Robert Don. The voice of Hidden Oaks, performed by Robert Don. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Find more of his works at dtschwartz.com. Produced by Robert Don, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. You can find out more online by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at Hidden Oaks Pod, as well as Facebook and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thank you for listening, and until next time.